They say empires never fall overnight. But if you listen closely, in the silence of forgotten ruins, you can almost hear the sound of decisions unmade. The Roman Empire, once the most powerful civilization on earth, didn't die in a single battle or from a single enemy. It died slowly, from the inside. Not with swords and fire, but with weak voices in marble halls, leaders who ruled without vision, and senators who cared more for pleasure than purpose. The Golden Empire that forgot how to lead. At the height of its glory, the Roman Empire stretched from the sands of Egypt to the misty forests of Britain. Roads carved across continents. Aqueducts carried clean water to marble cities. Legions marched in perfect rhythm, their discipline unmatched. From the outside, Rome looked eternal. But inside the heart of the empire, something fragile began to grow, a quiet arrogance, born of too much success. The people had forgotten what struggle felt like. Generals had begun to crave comfort more than conquest. And emperors, once chosen for wisdom and courage, now rose from bribery, flattery, and fear. It began after the death of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. He had been the last emperor who truly believed in duty above luxury. His journals spoke of balance, reason, and restraint, values that once made Rome great. But when he died in 180 AD, his son Commodus took the throne, a man who preferred the roar of the gladiator arena to the quiet of a council chamber. Under Commodus, the empire's golden mask began to crack. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, dressed in lion skins, and forced senators to bow before his statues. The treasury drained into endless festivals and games. The legions, unpaid and restless, began to sell their loyalty to the highest bidder. The Senate, once Rome's moral compass, had become a stage for survival. No one spoke truth anymore, only what the emperor wanted to hear. Behind the marble pillars of the Forum, whispers of rebellion began. Assassination plots became common conversation. And when Commodus was finally strangled in his bath by his own guards in 192 AD, it wasn't the end of the chaos, it was the beginning. For the first time in centuries, Rome had no rightful emperor. For men, each commanding different legions, declared themselves ruler. They marched against each other, burning cities, killing citizens, and draining the empire's strength. It was called the Year of the Five Emperors, a year when Rome was both the battlefield and the prize. In just 12 months, emperors were made and murdered like changing seasons. Every soldier fought not for Rome, but for whichever man promised the most gold. The mighty empire that had conquered the world was now devouring itself. Meanwhile, on the frontiers, the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Syria, Rome's enemies watched and waited. The Germanic tribes, the Parthians, the Goths, all saw the same thing: the lion was growing weak. And as the decades passed, the throne of Rome became a revolving door. Some emperors lasted years, others mere weeks. Power shifted with every whisper of betrayal. The empire was still enormous, still glittering, but its heart was rotting. Every new emperor promised reform. Every one of them failed. Some tried to restore order with kindness, others with cruelty. None could heal the sickness that had already taken root, the sickness of selfishness. By the dawn of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was no longer one. It was a collection of generals, provinces, and private armies pretending to serve the same flag. The Senate was powerless, the treasury empty, and the legions exhausted. And yet, the people of Rome still believed in the illusion. They filled the Colosseum. They cheered the games. They told themselves the empire would last forever. But every cheer echoed over cracks in marble and empty coffers. In the distance, smoke rose from border towns as barbarian raids became bolder. But the news barely reached the Senate floor. They were too busy debating titles, statues, and honors. History doesn't always shout when it changes. Sometimes it whispers, and the Romans weren't listening. The fall of Rome didn't begin with invasion. It began with comfort. With citizens who traded freedom for entertainment. With leaders who ruled not to serve, but to be adored. The empire that once conquered nations had forgotten how to conquer itself. And as the golden sun set over the Tiber River, one truth became clear. No empire, no matter how mighty, can survive the weakness of its own leaders. Imagine an empire so vast that no messenger could carry news from one end to the other before the emperor who sent him was already dead. That was Rome in the 3rd century, a land stretched too far, ruled by too many, and protected by too few. The year was 235 AD, and the Roman world stood at a crossroads. After the brief reign of Emperor Alexander Severus, the empire's fragile peace shattered like thin glass. Alexander had tried to calm the restless legions through negotiation, offering treaties and gold instead of battle. But the soldiers saw kindness as weakness. When the Germanic tribes pressed harder along the Rhine, the legions turned on their emperor. They surrounded his tent, shouting his name not as a cheer, but as a curse. Within moments, Rome's leader, and his mother, were murdered by their own army. His death marked the end of the Severan dynasty, and the beginning of chaos. Historians later called it the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when the empire nearly destroyed itself from within. A world without stability. In less than 50 years, over 20 emperors claimed the throne, most lasting only months before being killed in mutinies or battles. It was not politics anymore. It was survival. Every general with a loyal army became a threat. Every province became a potential rebellion. The empire had become too large to rule, too corrupt to trust, and too divided to defend. Frontier provinces stopped waiting for Rome's orders. They began appointing their own leaders, minting their own coins, and collecting their own taxes. Rome, once united by a single law and a single vision, had splintered into fragments of ambition. The army, once Rome's pride, had become its greatest danger. Legions no longer fought for ideals or the Senate. They fought for pay, power, and protection. A general who failed to reward his men with gold or glory was as good as dead. The emperor's throne became a gamble played with swords. Enemies at the gates, and within. While Rome's generals fought one another, its borders bled. In the north, the Goths raided deep into Roman territory, burning towns along the Danube. In the east, the Persian Empire under Shapur I crushed Roman forces and even captured Emperor Valerian alive, the first Roman ruler ever taken prisoner by a foreign power. It was a humiliation so great that Roman chroniclers could barely bring themselves to write it down. Legend says Valerian was forced to kneel so the Persian king could use his back as a human step to mount his horse. When he died in captivity, his skin was said to be stuffed with straw and displayed as a trophy. To the Roman world, it was unthinkable. The invincible empire, the one that had once conquered Carthage, Greece, and Egypt, was being humiliated by its neighbors. And still, inside the empire, the killing continued. The empire that tore itself apart. By the mid-3rd century, Rome had split into 3 separate empires. In the west, the Gallic Empire rose, controlling Gaul, Britain, and Spain. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire, led by the brilliant Queen Zenobia, ruled Egypt, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor. And in the middle sat the shattered remains of Rome itself, struggling to hold Italy and the Balkans. Each claimed to be the true Rome. Each minted coins with their own emperor's face. Each fought the others as enemies, even while foreign invaders tore through the borders. In just a few generations, the empire that had once united the known world was now eating itself alive. A fading dream. For ordinary Romans, the chaos was unbearable. Cities that had once thrived on trade were now ghost towns. Plague swept across the empire, killing thousands. Farms lay abandoned. Roads crumbled. Even the great Roman coin, once trusted across continents, became worthless, its silver diluted until it was little more than painted metal. Inflation soared. A loaf of bread that once cost a single denarius now required a handful. Merchants refused to sell without barter. The empire's economy, like its leadership, was collapsing under its own weight. And yet, in the midst of despair, the Roman people still clung to hope that another strong emperor might rise to restore order. They whispered the names of past heroes, Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, like prayers. But the gods of old Rome were silent. The age of the soldier emperors. In these desperate times, power belonged to the army. Emperors were no longer born in palaces, they were made in the camps. Hardened soldiers, raised from the ranks, took the purple cloak not through birthright but through blood. One such man was Claudius II, known as Gothicus, for his victory over the Goths in 268 AD. He restored courage, discipline, and a spark of hope. But like so many before him, he reigned for only 2 years before dying, likely of the plague. Then came Aurelian, a commander of relentless energy. He reunited the empire, defeating both Zenobia of Palmyra and the Gallic usurpers. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Rome had been reborn. He called himself Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But even Aurelian fell victim to treachery, murdered by his own officers over a forged document. In Rome, loyalty was always temporary. The quiet before the storm. By the end of the 3rd century, the empire had survived, barely. But it was no longer the Rome of Augustus. It was an empire constantly at war with itself, an old giant staggering under its own weight. The people had grown tired. The Senate, once proud, now bowed easily to whoever held the sword. The legions were fewer, the treasury emptier, the spirit weaker. In every province, statues of past emperors stood cracked and forgotten, eyes carved from marble staring into nothing. Rome had become a symbol, not of strength, but of endurance. It didn't rule the world anymore. It merely refused to die. And yet, history, like empires, moves in circles. Even as everything seemed lost, a few men still believed that Rome could be saved. They would rise soon, men like Diocletian and Constantine, to rebuild what centuries of weakness had nearly destroyed. But they would not rebuild the Rome that once was. The world was changing. And though no one knew it yet, the empire's rebirth would come with a price. Freedom for order, unity for faith, and the end of the old gods forever. Closing reflection. The crisis of the 3rd century taught the Romans a lesson they learned too late. An empire can survive war, famine, and even invasion. But it cannot survive leaders who serve themselves instead of their people. Rome's borders would be restored again, but the wound within, the wound of corruption, fear, and vanity, would never fully heal. By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was a ghost of its former self. But ghosts don't always vanish quietly. Sometimes, they fight to live again. And so, from the ruins of chaos rose 2 men, emperors who promised to heal the unhealable. They didn't save Rome forever. But they made it breathe again, just long enough to see its final sunset. A world in fragments. The year was 284 AD. Rome's roads were broken, its armies scattered, its faith uncertain. The empire had survived the crisis of the 3rd century, but survival was not victory. It was exhaustion. Then came Diocletian, a soldier from the dusty frontier of Dalmatia, not of noble birth, not of old Roman blood, but forged from hardship. He rose through the legions with quiet discipline, and when the empire once again fell into civil war, he took the purple cloak not as a dreamer, but as a repairman of ruins. Diocletian understood what others refused to see. Rome was too large for one man to rule. So, he did something no emperor before him dared: he divided power. He created the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 juniors, Caesars, each governing a region of the empire. For the first time in a century, there was order in chaos. The emperor who became a machine. Diocletian ruled like no emperor before him. He demanded obedience, not admiration. He abandoned the old illusion of the citizen emperor, a ruler among men, and replaced it with divine authority. He dressed in silk, surrounded himself with ceremony, and insisted that subjects prostrate themselves before him. To many Romans, it felt strange, almost Eastern, a step away from the simplicity of old Rome. But to Diocletian, symbolism was survival. The empire needed to fear power again, to believe in something unshakable. He restructured the army, rebuilt the borders, reformed the currency, and tried to fix the economy that had rotted for a century. For a while, it worked. The provinces quieted. The legions were paid. The frontiers stood strong. But Diocletian also feared disunity of belief. He saw the rise of a strange, stubborn faith, Christianity, spreading through his empire, ignoring the old gods and undermining imperial authority. And so began one of Rome's darkest persecutions. Churches were destroyed. Scriptures burned. Thousands of believers tortured or killed. To Diocletian, it was necessary. Unity through faith meant survival through control. To history, it was another wound Rome inflicted upon itself. The emperor who let go. Then, in 305 AD, something unprecedented happened. Diocletian, the most powerful man in the world, retired. No civil war forced him out. No assassin ended his rule. He simply walked away. He returned to his villa by the sea, to live among gardens and silence. When asked later if he might return to power, he smiled and said, If you could see the cabbages I grow, you would not ask me to take up that life again. It was the first peaceful abdication in Roman history. But peace would not last long. The system he built, the tetrarchy, began to fracture the moment he left. Each emperor had their own ambition, their own loyal armies. And once again, swords were drawn across the empire. The rise of Constantine. Out of the confusion came a name that would echo through centuries: Constantine. Born the son of a Roman officer and a woman of humble origin, Constantine witnessed firsthand the instability of the empire. He served under Diocletian's tetrarchy, watching its balance collapse. And when his father, Constantius, died in Britain, his troops declared him emperor. Once more, the Roman world plunged into civil war, this time between Constantine in the west and Maxentius in Rome. For years, the empire bled again. And then came the moment that changed not only Rome but the entire world. The vision in the sky. On the eve of battle near the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Constantine reportedly saw a vision in the sky, a shining cross of light above the sun, and beneath it, the words: "In hoc signo vinces, in this sign, you will conquer." That night, he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, 2 letters that formed the name of Christ. The next day, Constantine's army won a stunning victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as its sole ruler. The age of pagan Rome was ending. The age of Christian Rome had begun. The emperor of 2 worlds. Constantine was not just a conqueror, he was a reformer and a visionary. He reunited the empire under a single rule, stabilized its finances, and transformed its identity. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, granting freedom of worship to Christians, ending centuries of persecution. Churches were built across the empire, from Rome to Jerusalem. But Constantine's greatest act was not of faith, it was of geography. He founded a new capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Built on the site of the ancient Greek colony Byzantium, it lay between Europe and Asia, protected, rich, and strategic. He dreamed it would be the new Rome, a city untouched by the corruption of the old. And in many ways, it was. But by moving the heart of the empire east, Constantine unknowingly divided its soul. The west, Italy, Gaul, and Spain, began to fade into neglect. The east, with Constantinople at its center, grew in wealth and power. 2 Romes now existed, one ancient and decaying, the other newborn and ambitious. The split would shape the next 1,000 years. A fragile salvation. For a time, peace returned. Trade flowed again. The frontiers quieted. The empire, under Constantine, seemed reborn. But the old weaknesses still slept beneath the marble. The bureaucracy grew bloated, the army expensive, the provinces restless. And faith, once meant to unite, began to divide. The empire's new religion brought new conflicts, bishops arguing over doctrine, emperors choosing sides in theological wars. The sword and the cross, once allies, became rivals for the same throne. Constantine himself, baptized only on his deathbed, never saw the peace he dreamed of. When he died in 337 AD, the empire he restored was already splitting again, divided among his sons, who turned on one another just as their forefathers had. History, once again, was repeating itself. A quiet truth. Diocletian had rebuilt the empire with discipline. Constantine had rebuilt it with faith. But neither could rebuild what was truly lost, unity of purpose. Rome's problem had never been just its enemies. It was its own heart. It had forgotten why it ruled, what it meant to lead, and how to serve something greater than power itself. For all their brilliance, even the rebuilder emperors could not change that truth. Reflection. Empires do not crumble all at once. They fall in waves, of reform, recovery, and relapse. Diocletian and Constantine gave Rome its final breath, its final glow before darkness. But like the dying embers of a once great fire, their light only made the coming night seem deeper. The empire had been saved from collapse, for now. But the next generation would face what neither emperor could stop. The slow unraveling of the West, the rise of new invaders, and the final fading of the Roman dream. Every empire dreams of eternity. But eternity has a way of ending quietly, not with thunder, but with footsteps in the dark. By the 4th century, Rome had already outlived its golden age, its rebirth, and its reason. Now, it lived only on memory, and fear. The calm before the storm. When Constantine the Great died in 337 AD, the Roman Empire stood once again united, but fragile, like a cracked statue still gleaming in sunlight. His sons inherited his world, but not his wisdom. 3 brothers, 3 crowns, and 1 empire too vast for peace. Almost at once, civil war returned. Bloodlines meant nothing in Rome anymore. Family was just another battlefield. By the time the dust settled, 1 son remained, Constantius II, ruling a divided people and an overstretched frontier. Beyond those frontiers, something new was stirring, restless tribes, hungry for land, watching Rome's weakness like wolves circling a wounded deer. The Great Migration begins. For centuries, Rome's borders had held back the chaos beyond, the forests of Germania, the cold plains of Scythia, the shadowed lands of the north. But now, the pressure was building. Tribes long kept apart by distance and rivalries began to move, not just raiding, but migrating. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and Huns, names that would one day echo through the ashes of history. At first, Rome welcomed them. The empire was desperate for soldiers, workers, and taxpayers. Generals granted them land inside the frontiers in exchange for service. But the empire no longer had the strength to control what it allowed in. The barbarians didn't come as conquerors, not yet. They came as guests. But hungry guests soon become desperate ones. The Huns arrive. In the east, a storm was forming. The Huns, fierce horsemen from the Asian steppes, swept across Europe like fire. Tribes fled before them, seeking safety within Rome's borders. Among them were the Visigoths, led by their chieftain Fritigern. They begged Rome for refuge. Permission was granted, but mercy was not. Roman officials along the Danube exploited them cruelly, extorting food, stealing children, and selling dog meat at gold prices. The Goths, starving and betrayed, rose in rebellion. In 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, they faced the Roman army, and shattered it. Emperor Valens, who refused to wait for reinforcements, was killed in the battle, his body never found. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The legions that had once ruled the world were broken by refugees turned warriors. The shock was enormous. For the first time, the empire realized its enemies no longer feared Rome. A kingdom within the empire. The Gothic victory didn't destroy Rome, not yet. But it changed the balance forever. No longer could emperors command absolute loyalty from foreign troops. The empire had begun to rely on the very people it feared. The Goths were settled again within the empire, this time as foederati, allied soldiers under their own leaders, fighting for Rome in name but not in heart. They became both protectors and parasites. The emperor might wear the purple, but the sword was no longer his alone. Two empires, two fates. By the late 4th century, Rome officially split in two. The Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, rich, fortified, and adaptable. The Western Empire, ruled from Rome, then Milan, and finally Ravenna, poor, exhausted, and slowly dying. The East had trade, culture, and a manageable frontier. The West had decay. Every year, new lands were lost, Britain abandoned, Gaul invaded, Spain restless, Africa in revolt. And while the East learned to survive through diplomacy and wealth, the West kept fighting, and losing. The rise of Alaric. Among the Goths, a new leader emerged, Alaric, a soldier once trained by Rome itself. He had fought for the empire and seen its weakness from within. When he was denied a promised command, bitterness turned to ambition. He gathered his people and marched toward Italy. He did not come as an invader, at least not at first. He demanded payment, land, and respect. The Roman Senate offered words, then silence, then treachery. Alaric's patience broke. In 410 AD, his armies surrounded the Eternal City. The sack of Rome. For nearly 800 years, Rome had been untouchable, the heart of the world, the city of marble and empire. No enemy had entered its gates since the Gauls in ancient times. But on a dark night in August, the unimaginable happened. The gates were opened, perhaps by slaves, perhaps by fear. The Visigoths poured in. Fires burned across the Forum. Temples were stripped, palaces looted, the tombs of emperors broken open. Yet it was not total destruction. Alaric ordered his men to spare churches, to avoid killing civilians. It was not vengeance, it was symbolism. The invincible city had fallen, not to barbarians of savagery, but to the consequences of its own weakness. When dawn came, Rome was silent. The empire lived on, but the illusion had died. A dying empire that refused to fall. After the sack, the Western Empire limped on for another half-century, a hollow shell propped up by foreign generals and fading titles. Real power lay with the armies, most of them Germanic mercenaries loyal only to gold. Emperors came and went like shadows, Honorius, Valentinian III, Petronius Maximus, Avitus, names lost to time, each weaker than the last. The Senate, once the soul of Rome, debated as if the world were not burning. Meanwhile, new kingdoms rose within its borders. The Vandals in North Africa. The Franks in Gaul. The Visigoths in Spain. All claimed to rule in the name of Rome. But none obeyed it. The last emperor. In 476 AD, a young boy sat upon the imperial throne, Romulus Augustulus, emperor in name only. He was the child of a general, a puppet in a decaying empire. Outside the walls of Ravenna, the Germanic warlord Odoacer led his troops to the city's gates. No grand battle followed. No legions came to defend the boy. Odoacer entered the city, removed the imperial regalia, and sent it east to Constantinople, a silent message to the Eastern Emperor. The West needs no emperor. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire ended. No trumpet sounded. No historians recorded the exact hour. The lights simply dimmed, and went out. The echo that never faded. Rome did not vanish. Its laws, its language, its roads, its dream of order, all survived in the kingdoms that followed. The empire died, but its shadow ruled for 1,000 more years in the minds of men. Even in its fall, Rome taught the world what an empire could be, and what it must never become. Because in the end, it was not the barbarians who destroyed Rome. They merely walked through the gates left open by its own leaders. Reflection. The story of Rome's fall is not about one battle or one emperor. It is about the slow erosion of strength by comfort, of vision by vanity, of unity by fear. An empire that conquered the world forgot how to conquer itself. And when the final silence came, it was not a tragedy, it was a warning. For every empire that rises high enough to believe it can never fall, is already an empire that conquered the world forgot how to conquer itself. And when the final silence came, it was not a tragedy, it was a warning. For every empire that rises high enough to believe it can never fall, is already halfway gone. They say a man can't stop a river with his hands. But in the twilight of Rome, one emperor tried. He faced chaos, corruption, and betrayal, not from enemies beyond the walls, but from those who once swore to protect him. His name was Diocletian, and for a moment, it seemed he might save the Roman Empire from its own collapse. The emperor who tried to save a dying world asterisk. When Diocletian rose to power in 284 AD, Rome was barely recognizable. The empire that had once stretched across the known world was now divided by warlords, ruined by inflation, and haunted by fear. The legions were starving. The provinces were rebelling. The Senate was little more than a ghost of its former glory. Rome was, by all measures, dying. But Diocletian was no ordinary man. He came from humble origins, the son of a freed slave from the province of Dalmatia. Unlike the pampered nobles before him, he knew hardship. He had seen soldiers bleed, had marched in the cold, had lived among ordinary men. And perhaps that was what made him different. He did not dream of luxury or monuments. He dreamed of order. A government divided by design. Diocletian knew one truth above all: the empire was too large for one man to rule. The borders stretched thousands of miles. Enemies pressed in from every direction. No emperor, no matter how capable, could defend it all. So he did something no one before him dared to do: he divided the empire. He appointed another emperor, his trusted friend Maximian, to rule the western half, while he governed the east. Together, they appointed two junior emperors, called Caesars, to serve beneath them. It was a radical experiment in shared power, known as the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. Each emperor had his own army, capital, and court, but all swore allegiance to Rome. At first, it worked. Frontiers were stabilized. Taxes were reformed. The economy began to breathe again. Temples were repaired. Roads were built. Even the coinage was fixed. Diocletian introduced new silver and bronze standards to fight hyperinflation. For a brief, shining moment, the empire seemed reborn. But history has a way of repeating itself. Control through fear. To maintain this fragile order, Diocletian ruled with iron precision. He reorganized provinces, increased bureaucracy, and created a network of spies to watch over officials. Every corner of the empire reported back to him. And while it brought stability, it also brought fear. The empire became a machine, efficient, but merciless. Citizens were bound to their trades by law. Sons had to follow their fathers' professions. Farmers couldn't leave their land. Freedom was sacrificed for the illusion of order. Even religion was not spared. In 303 AD, Diocletian launched one of the largest persecutions of Christians in Roman history. He saw their refusal to worship Roman gods as a threat to unity, a rebellion against the old order. Temples were restored, sacrifices made, and those who resisted were hunted. The empire once tolerant of many gods had become intolerant in its fear of division. The burden of power. For 20 years, Diocletian ruled with unmatched efficiency. He had rebuilt the broken world he inherited. But power, even disciplined power, is a heavy burden. In 305 AD, something unheard of happened in Roman history. Diocletian voluntarily stepped down from power. He retired to his palace in modern-day Croatia, tending gardens and watching the empire from afar. When asked later why he left, he replied, "If you could see the cabbages I grow, you would never again want to be emperor." It was both wisdom and warning. He had seen what power did to men, and he wanted no more of it. But the moment he left, the system he built began to crumble. The return of chaos. Without Diocletian's authority, his successors turned on one another. The tetrarchy that once balanced power became a civil war of ambition. Each man claimed divine right. Each army fought for its own emperor. And in the middle of this storm, one name began to rise: Constantine. He was a soldier, a strategist, and soon, a legend. But his rise would not bring peace, it would bring a new Rome, and a new faith that would forever change the empire. It was the night before battle. A young emperor stood alone, gazing at the dark horizon, a man at war not only with his enemies, but with his own doubts. And then, something appeared in the sky. A symbol of light, unlike anything Rome had ever seen. A sign that would not only decide the fate of an empire, but change the faith of the entire world. The emperor who saw the cross in the sky *. After Diocletian's retirement, the empire he built began to shatter once again. 4 emperors turned into 6. 6 into 8. Each commanding their own armies, each claiming to be the one true ruler of Rome. The world had grown tired of blood. The legions, once symbols of Roman discipline, had become soldiers of fortune, loyal to whoever paid them best. And among the chaos, in the province of Gaul, modern France, rose a man destined to rewrite history: Constantine. The rise of Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's junior emperors. He had grown up in the shadow of civil wars, trained in strategy, skilled in survival. He was not born into the luxury of Rome's golden palaces, but into a world where loyalty could kill you and bravery was your only shield. When his father died in 306 AD, the legions in Britain hailed Constantine as emperor. But the title was dangerous. In the east, Galerius and Maxentius both claimed the same crown. Rome once had one emperor. Now it had three, and only one could survive. The road to Rome. For 6 years, Constantine marched through provinces, fighting rival armies, forging alliances, and slowly claiming the loyalty of the Roman people. He was different from other generals. He paid his soldiers fairly. He spoke to them not as a god, but as a leader who shared their hardships. And his army followed him, not out of fear, but out of faith. In 312 AD, Constantine set his eyes on Rome itself. There, Maxentius waited with a massive force, fortified behind the walls of the Eternal City. The two men were about to decide the future of the empire. The vision. It was the night before the battle. Constantine's camp was silent, the fires burning low. He knew his army was outnumbered. He knew the next day could be his last. And then, as the ancient writers tell it, he saw a vision. In the sky above the setting sun appeared a bright cross of light, and beneath it the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you will conquer. Later that night, as he slept, Christ appeared to him in a dream, commanding him to carry that same symbol, the Chi, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, into battle. When he awoke, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the sign on their shields. The empire that had once persecuted Christians now carried their symbol into war. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. October 28, 312 AD. The Tiber River shimmered beneath the autumn sun. Two massive armies faced each other near the Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome. As the battle began, Constantine's troops advanced with their new emblem held high. Maxentius's army, overconfident and crowded near the river, began to falter. When the bridge collapsed under the weight of retreating soldiers, thousands drowned in the Tiber, including Maxentius himself. Constantine entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a savior. And the people welcomed him with open arms. For the first time in decades, the city had one emperor, and a new hope. The birth of a new Rome. In the months that followed, Constantine declared an end to Christian persecution. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan granting freedom of religion to all citizens of the empire. Churches were built where temples once stood. The cross, once a symbol of shame, became the mark of power and divine favor. Rome, once built on pagan gods and blood sacrifices, now began its transformation into a Christian empire. But Constantine was not only a man of faith, he was a man of vision. He saw that Rome, the old capital, was too corrupt, too fragile to be reborn. So he looked east, toward the ancient city of Byzantium, and decided to build a new capital there. He called it Nova Roma. But the world would come to know it by another name. Constantinople. The emperor's burden. For the next 2 decades, Constantine ruled a world in transition. He rebuilt roads, restored the economy, and brought stability where chaos once reigned. He blended the old traditions of Rome with the new faith of Christianity, balancing gods and beliefs in a delicate harmony. Yet even greatness carries shadows. In his later years, Constantine became more autocratic, more divine in his rule. The same man who ended persecution began to blur the line between power and faith. And when he finally died in 337 AD, baptized only on his deathbed, he left behind a question that would echo for centuries. Did he convert out of belief, or out of strategy? The cross and the crown. Whatever his reasons, Constantine changed history. He turned the empire's heart from marble idols to sacred crosses. He gave Christianity protection, and, in time, political power. But with that blessing came a curse. The faith of the humble would soon become the faith of emperors, and power, once again, would corrupt belief. As the centuries turned, Constantine's dream of unity would fracture. The empire he revived would split again, into East and West, until one half would vanish forever. But for now, in the quiet of his new capital, the lights of Constantinople shone over the Bosporus. Rome had been reborn. For the last time. It was quiet, too quiet for Rome. The streets that once echoed with triumphal parades now whispered with fear. The marble city that ruled the world was surrounded, not by an army of emperors, but by outsiders who once begged to serve its legions. And on one cold morning in 410 AD, the impossible finally happened. Rome fell, ****. The barbarians at the gate. The end of the Western Roman Empire did not come from one battle, one emperor, or one enemy. It came like a slow, creeping winter, year by year, weakening its heart until the final frost broke it apart. By the beginning of the 5th century, the empire in the West was a shadow of its former self. Its emperors ruled not from Rome, but from Ravenna, a marshy fortress far to the north, safer, they thought, from invaders. But safety has a price. When Rome's leaders left the eternal city, they left behind its people, and its soul. The arrival of the Goths. The story of Rome's fall truly begins with a name, Alaric. Alaric was a Visigoth, a member of a Germanic tribe that had once fought for Rome, serving as allies and mercenaries. They had marched under Roman banners, fought Roman wars, and bled for Roman emperors. But when they asked for land, pay, and respect, they were treated as barbarians. For years, the Goths roamed the empire's frontiers, hungry, desperate, and angry. They had seen the weakness of Roman politics, the endless power struggles, the corruption, the betrayals. And in 408 AD, Alaric decided to stop begging. He would take what Rome refused to give. The Siege of Rome. In the autumn of 408, the Gothic army surrounded the city of Rome. It had been nearly 800 years since a foreign enemy had stood before its gates. Inside, famine spread. The aqueducts were cut off. The markets were empty. The Senate sent envoys to Alaric, offering gold to buy peace. He accepted, but when the emperor in Ravenna refused to honor the agreement, Alaric returned. In 410 AD, he came again, this time, not for ransom, but for retribution. On the night of August 24, 410, the gates of Rome were opened from within, perhaps by slaves, perhaps by despair. Alaric's army entered the Eternal City. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered Rome, its palaces, its temples, its treasures. Fires burned in the Forum. The cries of the people echoed through streets that once hailed Caesar. It was the first time in nearly 8 centuries that Rome had fallen to an enemy. The empire that had conquered the world could not defend its own capital. The shock of the world. When news of Rome's sack spread across the empire, people wept. The poet Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote, "The city which took the whole world is itself taken." It was unthinkable, a nightmare made real. For generations, Rome had been more than a city, it was a symbol of civilization, law, and divine order. Now it was ashes. Yet even as it burned, the empire still clung to life. The emperors continued to rule from Ravenna, pretending the heart of Rome still beat. But the truth was clear. The West was dying. The endless invasions. In the years that followed, one wave after another struck the crumbling empire. The Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa, cutting off Rome's grain supply. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, stormed through Gaul and Italy, leaving cities in ruin. The Franks, Saxons, and Burgundians carved out kingdoms from Roman provinces. The legions, once disciplined and proud, were filled with foreign soldiers fighting for pay, not for patriotism. Roman generals made alliances with the same tribes that once sacked their cities. Every province became its own kingdom, every army, its own master. And the emperors? Most were little more than boys. Puppets placed on the throne by powerful generals who ruled from behind the curtain. The last emperor. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was little more than a name. Italy was poor, the army unpaid, the Senate powerless. And in that year, a Germanic general named Odoacer decided the charade had gone on long enough. He marched into Ravenna, deposed the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial crown to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno. With that act, the Western Roman Empire was no more. There was no final battle, no heroic stand, only a quiet surrender to inevitability. The Roman flag was lowered. The legions disbanded. And 1,000 years of empire ended not with thunder, but with silence. The dawn after the fall. But history never ends. Even in ruin, Rome lived on, in its laws, its language, its faith. The Church, born in its shadows, rose to take its place. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years, guarding the last flame of Roman civilization. And though the marble crumbled and the legions vanished, the dream of Rome, the dream of power, order, and eternity, never truly died. It became the foundation of the world that came after. Every kingdom that rose in Europe called itself Rome in some way, the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Tsars, even the dreamers who built new nations across the sea. Rome was gone, but not forgotten. It had become an idea, too powerful to destroy, too human to perfect. The whisper of the ruins. If you walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum today, the stones still speak. Not in words, but in echoes. They whisper of senators who once debated destiny, of emperors who promised eternity, of legions who marched believing Rome could never fall. But every empire falls. Not because of enemies at the gate. The empire was reborn, but not reunited. Two suns now rose over Rome. One in the east, bright and rising. One in the west, fading into shadow. And as the centuries turned, their destinies would drift apart, until only one Rome would remain. The two Romes, east and west, divide the empire asterisk. When Constantine the Great died in 337 AD, his dream of a single, stable empire did not die with him, but it began to fracture almost immediately. He had 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. Each inherited a portion of the empire. Each promised to rule in peace. And, like so many Roman promises, it shattered within a few short years. Brothers at war. The 3 sons of Constantine turned against each other almost at once. Power was too tempting, too intoxicating. In 340 AD, Constantine II marched against his brother Constans, and was killed in battle. A few years later, Constans was murdered by his own generals. Only Constantius II survived, and he ruled the empire alone, his heart hardened by betrayal. Under Constantius, the empire was united in name, but divided in spirit. The West and the East had grown different, in wealth, in culture, in strength. Rome itself, once the beating heart of civilization, was slowly becoming irrelevant. The shifting power of the East. In the East, Constantinople glittered. Its walls were new, its streets alive with traders from Asia, Africa, and Greece. Gold poured into its markets, scholars filled its libraries. The eastern half of the empire, richer, safer, and more urban, began to thrive on trade and diplomacy rather than conquest. But the West? The West was growing old. Rome, once the queen of cities, was now a relic, filled with monuments to a glory no one remembered how to rebuild. The western provinces were poorer, their roads crumbling, their legions stretched thin. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and the Danube. And the emperors in Rome, desperate for soldiers, began hiring these same tribes as mercenaries. They didn't realize it yet, but they were inviting their own conquerors inside the gates. Julian the philosopher, the last pagan emperor. Amid this slow decline, one man briefly tried to turn Rome back to its roots. In 361 AD, Julian, a nephew of Constantine, became emperor. He was a philosopher, a dreamer, and a pagan. Julian despised the Christian bishops who now filled the imperial court. He sought to restore the old gods, the ancient rites, the temples that once defined Rome's soul. He believed the empire had lost its power when it abandoned Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. For 2 short years, he ruled with courage and conviction. But his reforms came too late. The old faith was dying, and the new faith was too strong. When Julian fell in battle in Persia, mortally wounded, he is said to have whispered his final words. "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean." With his death, pagan Rome was gone forever. The empire divides for good. By 395 AD, after decades of political instability, Emperor Theodosius I became the last man to rule both halves of the empire. When he died, he divided it between his 2 sons. Arcadius ** took the east. Honorius ** took the west. It was meant to be practical, a way to govern more efficiently. But in truth, it was the beginning of the end. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, would endure for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire, centered in Rome and later Ravenna, would not survive another century. The split was not only political, it was cultural. The East spoke Greek. The West spoke Latin. The East worshipped with icons and hymns. The West built churches of stone and silence. 2 Romes, 2 hearts, 2 futures. The gathering storm. In the West, the situation grew dire. Barbarian invasions increased every year: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns. The once mighty legions were outnumbered, outpaid, and often outmatched. Emperors came and went like shadows. Many were children, puppets controlled by generals or foreign mercenaries. The Senate had no power, the treasury no gold, and the people no hope. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople grew stronger. Its walls stood unbroken. Its emperors ruled from marble palaces, watching as the western half of the empire crumbled piece by piece. It was as if Rome's soul had split, one side brilliant and eternal, the other doomed and dying. The decline of the West. By the late 4th century, refugees poured into the Western Empire, whole tribes fleeing the terror of the Huns, who thundered across the plains of Europe like a storm. The Roman frontier collapsed under the pressure. And when the empire turned to the east for help, none came. The two halves that were once one body now stood apart, watching, waiting, surviving separately. The West was no longer the center of the world. It was becoming a memory. The end of an era. As the candles burned low in Rome's Senate house, the marble statues still gleamed, reminders of gods long gone, of emperors long forgotten. The people still spoke of Rome's greatness, but their voices echoed through empty streets. The eternal city was still standing, but its empire had already fallen in spirit. Far away, in Constantinople, the new Rome was rising, the Rome of domes and mosaics, of scholars and saints. It would carry the name of empire into a new age. But for the old Rome, the night was coming. Rome had fallen. The West was a shadow of its former glory. But one empire refused to die. From the east, a new Rome rose, a city of domes, mosaics, and golden light, destined to preserve the legacy of the ancients for another 1,000 years. The empire that refused to die. While the Western Empire crumbled beneath the weight of invaders, the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, stood strong. Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great on the ruins of Byzantium, was a city designed to last. Protected by massive walls, surrounded by water on 3 sides, it was nearly impossible to conquer. Its streets gleamed with marble, its markets overflowed with silk and spices from Asia, and its people were both Romans and something new, Byzantines. Justinian and the dream of renewal. In 527 AD, a remarkable emperor ascended the throne, Justinian I, known later as Justinian the Great. He inherited an empire that had survived the fall of the West, but it was fragile. The borders were threatened by Persians in the east and Slavs and Vandals in the west. Yet Justinian dreamed of restoring the glory of Rome. He launched ambitious campaigns to reclaim lost territories, North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, seeking to reunite the empire under one rule. He rebuilt cities, constructed Hagia Sophia, and codified Roman law into what would become the Corpus Juris Civilis, a legal legacy that influenced Europe for centuries. For a brief moment, it seemed that Rome could rise again, not in Italy, not in the West, but in the East. Culture and faith. The Eastern Empire preserved what the West had lost. Greek and Roman knowledge thrived in libraries. Art, architecture, and literature blended classical traditions with Christian devotion. Christianity, now the official faith, shaped governance, education, and daily life. Yet even here, politics and faith were inseparable. The emperor was not only ruler of men, but guardian of the Church. A divine authority as well as temporal. The new eternal city. The city itself became a symbol of endurance. Its walls, towers, and gates repelled invaders for centuries. Its strategic location allowed trade to flow from Europe to Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. Merchants, scholars, and soldiers mingled in its streets. Even as the Western Empire dissolved into kingdoms and warlords, Constantinople thrived. The city was Rome reborn, but not Rome as it once had been. It was stronger, smarter, and more cautious. It would survive the storms that had swallowed the West. The East outlives the West. While the Western Empire faded into legend by 476 AD, the Eastern Empire endured. For another 1,000 years, it would resist invaders, preserve knowledge, and inspire civilizations across Europe and Asia. Even when the walls eventually fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, Constantinople's legacy remained, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of Rome's memory, a testament to endurance. The lesson of Byzantium. Rome's story did not end with collapse. It transformed. Where one empire fell, another rose. Where one Rome was lost, another endured. The Eastern Empire showed that even in the shadow of defeat, vision, planning, and faith could preserve a civilization long after its original heart had stopped beating. Rome, it seemed, was eternal, not in territory, but in spirit. Reflection. History is not always about endings. Sometimes, it is about resilience. When the West fell, the East learned. When empires crumble, some memories survive, in law, in art, in faith, in cities. And in the story of Byzantium, the heartbeat of Rome continued, slow, steady, unbroken by time. When Rome fell, the world did not stop. It shifted quietly, like sand slipping through fingers. The streets of the eternal city grew silent, yet the echoes of its empire shaped kingdoms yet to come. A new era was dawning, one built on ruins, law, and memory. The seeds of the Middle Ages *. By the late 5th century, Western Europe was no longer Roman. Italy, Gaul, Spain, and Britain were ruled by barbarian kings, Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, and Saxons. The legions were gone. The Senate was powerless. Rome's citizens had become subjects in a world that no longer resembled the empire they had known. Yet the legacy of Rome lingered in subtle, quiet ways. Law ***, the codified principles of Roman justice survived in local courts and later influenced medieval kingdoms. Infrastructure ***, roads, aqueducts, and bridges continued to connect towns long after emperors had abandoned them. Culture ***, Latin remained the language of learning and the Church, preserving literature, history, and philosophy. Even in chaos, Rome whispered lessons to those who would listen. The role of the Church. As secular power waned, the Church rose. Bishops became governors, monasteries became schools, and Rome's spiritual authority became the new pillar of stability. The Pope, seated in the city that had once been the imperial capital, guided kings and peoples alike. Christianity, which had once been persecuted, became the backbone of Europe's identity. Through the Church, the memory of Rome endured. The idea of an empire, the notion of order, and the dream of civilization, all carried on in prayers, rituals, and sacred texts. Barbarian kingdoms and Roman memory. The so-called barbarians, who settled in former Roman lands, were not destroyers alone. Many adopted Roman customs. They minted coins in Roman style. They maintained cities as centers of administration. They learned Latin to communicate with Roman populations. Rome lived on, not as an empire, but as a cultural and administrative model. Europe's medieval kingdoms were built atop Roman foundations, even if they did not realize it. Continuity amid change. Trade continued along Roman roads. Farmers cultivated fields first measured by Roman surveyors. Writers read Virgil, historians studied Livy, and monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. Even as kings and warlords carved Europe into small territories, the structures Rome had built, law, literacy, infrastructure, persisted. Rome had fallen physically, yet its influence endured invisibly. The Western Empire may have died, but its seed sprouted in the soil of the Middle Ages. Reflection. History is less about abrupt ends than gentle transformations. Rome did not vanish overnight. Its people, ideas, and systems slowly reshaped the world around them. The Middle Ages were not a dark age, they were a continuation of Rome in disguise, hidden beneath new kingdoms, new rulers, and new faith. The empire's lessons, both its brilliance and its failures, quietly guided Europe for centuries to come. The Romans were gone, but their world was not. It had been inherited by a new generation, warriors, kings, and shepherds who had once been called barbarians. Now they held the keys to civilization, tasked with guarding, shaping, and sometimes reshaping what Rome had left behind. The Germanic kingdoms asterisk. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Western Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy. The Visigoths controlled Spain. The Franks settled in Gaul. The Vandals dominated North Africa. Each kingdom was different, yet all shared one thing: the heritage of Rome. They retained Roman laws, cities, and traditions, even if their customs, speech, and culture had changed. The Franks, builders of a new order. The Franks, a Germanic tribe from the Rhine, slowly became the most influential kingdom in Western Europe. Under leaders like Clovis I, they adopted Christianity, which helped unify their people and connect them to Roman traditions. Clovis preserved Roman law for his subjects while ruling with his own Germanic codes, a careful balance of old and new. The Franks built roads, maintained cities, and collected taxes, the Roman way, but infused it with the strength of their warrior culture. The Ostrogoths, Rome's temporary protectors. In Italy, the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric the Great, governed with surprising respect for Roman customs. Theodoric admired Roman administration, culture, and art. He kept Roman senators in their positions, repaired buildings, and maintained the aqueducts and roads. Rome's city life, though diminished, persisted. The old monuments stood, and the streets remained organized. Even the temples were repurposed, not destroyed, as Christianity reshaped spiritual life. Visigoths in Spain. Spain became a kingdom under the Visigoths, who had settled there after fleeing the Huns. They combined Roman infrastructure with their own tribal codes. While the countryside often fell under local lords' control, cities maintained trade, law, and culture inherited from Rome. Even in these barbarian kingdoms, the spirit of Rome survived, invisible, steady, quietly guiding Europe toward its medieval future. Roman influence in daily life. Rome's legacy survived not in battles, but in everyday life. Farmers tilled lands organized by Roman surveyors. Markets functioned along Roman trade routes. Latin remained the language of scholarship, law, and the church. Even kings depended on Roman administration to manage their territories. They could conquer land, but they could not erase the systems Rome had built. Reflection. The Germanic kingdoms were not destroyers of Rome, they were its heirs. They preserved the empire's ideas, laws, and culture, even as they transformed the political landscape. Rome's collapse in the West was not an end. It was a quiet handoff, a passing of responsibility from emperors to kings, from legions to warriors, from monuments to villages. History continued, softly, like the slow turning of a page. Rome lived on, not as a city or empire, but as a legacy in the hands of those who inherited it. When the emperors fell and the legions vanished, one institution remained. It was neither a king nor a soldier. It did not march in armor or conquer with fire. Yet it carried Rome's legacy, law, and order into the centuries to come. It was the Church, Rome's last empire. The Church as guardian of Rome *. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, many ruled by former barbarians. Yet one constant persisted, the Christian Church, centered in Rome. The Pope, seated in the city that had once been the capital of emperors, became the spiritual and political authority. Bishops and abbots oversaw education, law, and welfare. Monasteries became safe havens for learning, preserving Latin texts, copying manuscripts, and teaching young minds. Rome's culture, in a sense, continued through the Church, a quiet, resilient heartbeat in a fractured world. The Church as political power. In the absence of strong emperors, the Church filled the void. Popes mediated disputes between kings. They blessed armies, negotiated treaties, and guided rulers who had no training in governance. Some popes even crowned emperors, like Charlemagne, in a symbolic restoration of Roman authority. The Church's power was subtle yet profound. Where Rome once ruled with armies and laws, the Church ruled with faith, influence, and moral authority. Preserving knowledge. The monasteries were Europe's libraries and universities. Monks preserved texts of Roman law, literature, and philosophy. Without them, the works of Cicero, Virgil, and Livy might have been lost. Rome's legacy survived in prayer, in ink, and in careful copying, a quiet revolution that kept knowledge alive for future generations. The spread of Rome's influence. Through Christianity, Rome's culture spread far beyond its old borders. Even kingdoms that were once enemies of Rome adopted the Latin language for law and religion. Roman traditions blended with Germanic customs, shaping the foundations of medieval Europe. Rome had fallen politically, but its influence endured. The empire had changed form, no longer bound by walls or legions, but by faith, ideas, and culture. Reflection. The Church became the last true empire of Rome. It did not conquer with swords. It did not rule with fear. It guided, preserved, and protected. Through its quiet authority, Rome's memory endured. Its laws, art, education, and ideals became the roots of Europe. Even as kings rose and fell, the Church held fast, a living link to a world that seemed lost. Rome's legacy was no longer in emperors, legions, or marble, but in ideas that survived centuries. The emperors were gone. The legions were gone. Yet Europe was not empty. It was filled with new kings, warriors who once clashed with Rome, now learning to rule, guided by an institution older than any crown, the Church. The barbarian kings and the Church *. After Rome's fall, the Germanic kingdoms that replaced it needed more than swords to survive. They needed law, order, and legitimacy, all of which the Church could provide. Kings like Clovis of the Franks turned to Christianity to unify their people. By converting, Clovis not only gained the support of the Church but also inherited a connection to the authority of Rome. Through baptism, he symbolically joined the legacy of the Roman emperors. Even as he ruled a Germanic kingdom. Alliances of faith and power. The Church and the kings formed a delicate balance. The Church gained protection ***, monasteries, bishops, and cathedrals flourished under royal support. Kings gained legitimacy ***, the Pope's blessing transformed warriors into rulers with moral authority. These alliances shaped medieval Europe. When Charlemagne rose centuries later, he would inherit this tradition, crowned by the Pope, recognized as a continuation of Rome's authority in the West. The preservation of Roman knowledge. Even as barbarians ruled, Roman knowledge survived thanks to the Church's guidance. Monks copied Roman manuscripts, preserving Latin literature, philosophy, and science. Roman laws influenced new codes, blending with Germanic customs. Education spread through cathedral schools, ensuring that Roman traditions lived on in new generations. Rome was no longer an empire in territory, it had become an empire of ideas and culture. Cities and governance. Many former Roman cities remained centers of administration. The Church often acted as the bridge between kings and the urban population, overseeing taxation, trade, and law. Rome's roads, aqueducts, and civic structures continued to be used, a reminder that even fallen empires leave behind lasting frameworks. Kings learned from the past, adapting Roman systems to their own rule. Europe was slowly becoming more organized, more connected, a patchwork of kingdoms built upon the bones of Rome. Reflection. In the centuries after Rome fell, the barbarian kings were not destroyers, they were students of history. They inherited Rome's cities, roads, laws, and culture. And the Church taught them how to wield this inheritance responsibly, blending Roman legacy with new traditions. Europe was being shaped quietly, patiently, a world emerging from ruins, guided by faith, memory, and the subtle power of ideas. Rome had fallen, but its influence had not. It had been handed to new hands, ready to grow into something different yet deeply rooted in the past. A crown rested upon his head. But it was more than gold and jewels. It was the weight of history, of centuries of empire and ambition. A new Rome was being born, not in marble or marble columns, but in faith, law, and kingdoms united under one ruler. The new emperor *. By the late 8th century, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms still recovering from the fall of Rome. The Franks had become powerful, but the dream of a united empire seemed distant. Then came Charlemagne, also called Charles the Great. He was a warrior, a statesman, and a visionary. He expanded his kingdom across modern-day France, Germany, and beyond, bringing stability where chaos had reigned. Alliance with the Church. Charlemagne's greatest strength was his partnership with the Church. By aligning closely with the Pope, he gained legitimacy and divine authority. In 800 AD, on Christmas Day, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. This moment was symbolic. It revived the idea of a Western Empire. It connected the new Frankish kingdom with the legacy of Rome. It sent a message that power and faith were intertwined, a tradition Rome had begun centuries earlier. Governance and reforms. Charlemagne understood that an empire was more than conquest. He implemented administrative reforms ***. Local governors, or counts, oversaw regions, ensuring order. Education reforms ***. Monks and scholars taught reading, writing, and Latin, preserving knowledge. Legal reforms ***. Roman and local laws were combined to create fairer governance. He ruled with both strength and wisdom, balancing the warrior's sword with the scholar's insight. The legacy of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's empire was not as vast as Rome, nor as permanent, but it preserved Rome's idea of unity. It demonstrated that even centuries after the Western Empire fell, the dream of a single, organized, and Christian Europe could be revived. Through Charlemagne, the legacy of Rome lived on, in education, law, religion, and the very notion of empire. Reflection. History often repeats itself quietly, in new forms. Rome had fallen. Kings had risen. But Charlemagne showed that the lessons of the past, about order, law, and faith, could be applied to a new age. The empire he built was not Rome of marble and stone. It was Rome of ideas and structure, a reminder that greatness can survive even after collapse. Rome's spirit endured, waiting patiently for those wise enough to learn from it.